everybody? Oh, good. Everybody can hear me. Everything is fine. I'll apologize in advance because when I get really nervous, I speak really quickly. And so I'm supposed to be here for 45 minutes, and I'm going to try and at least hit 25. And hopefully over time, I'll slow down. I love the fact that Pam started her talk about where you're from, because I think how we get to these places is kind of interesting, and for me, it's no different. I grew up in Canada. I went to school. I studied Canadian, more Canadians in the house. I studied sociology at the University of Toronto, and I really believed in storytelling and crafting messages to kind of activate change. So I went to work for the Toronto Star, which is Canada's largest newspaper, for over a decade. And then I went to agency side, and I really believed that we could make messages and create messages to help consumers and citizens make different changes. Fast forward to 2007, I found myself living in Tokyo. I fell in love with a musician. He went, I followed, and I didn't have the language skills to work in my field. So it was a time to kind of make a shift. And 2007, I don't know if you remember, was kind of the era, it was just after Al Gore had come out with his movie. It seemed like climate change was a really big topic. And I got really excited by how fast organic food had become a movement. Because in 2002, I don't know how many remember, the USDA came out with the organic food symbol and started to place it on product. And they had 2% growth year over year. So in the 5-year period from 2002 until I started Magnifeco.com, they had 10% market penetration. Consumers knew how to find organic food, and they were actually buying it. And I thought, if we could do this for fashion, what a difference we could make. If consumers could understand what the equivalent of organic food would be, what could we do to the industry? So back then in 2007, ethical fashion was considered 1% of the entire footprint of fashion. Here we are almost 10 years later, we're still at 1%, but it hasn't changed my belief that we can continue to do that. So to make it all happen, I launched this blog called Magnifeco.com, and it was a daily eco-fashion find. I was really trying to help consumers see what designers and what brands were doing differently. And the only criteria is that you had to ship globally. Because I was living in Tokyo, I thought, okay, you know what, it doesn't matter where in the world. If consumers understand that this is a different product, that this is a product that's made better, and they can put their consumer dollar towards it, then they need to be able to do that from wherever they are on the planet. Then over time, the product kind of grew. It became a little bit more diverse. Media has changed over time. So now it's become a podcast. I do a weekly podcast I record in Brooklyn. It became a book. And the book actually came out of a series that I created, an event series in 2013. The Tokyo earthquake, nuclear disaster, tsunami happened in 2011, and I emigrated to the US in 2012. And I was given permission to live but not to work. Any Canadians who live in this country know how challenging it is to move to this country. So I thought, okay, you know what? I'll start something for free until my paperwork comes in. I'll continue these conversations. So I put the blog on hiatus, and I started eco sessions because I wanted to have face-to-face conversations. I thought it's enough for me to continue to tell stories about designers and brands who are doing things differently. Why don't the brands tell the consumers? Why don't we have these events where they can actually engage? And it turned out to be phenomenally successful. It was also very illuminating, because the very first event we did in 2013 in Boston, and it was called Sustainable Textiles. And we had an apparel brand who did natural dyeing from India. We had an interior design brand who did natural dyeing, and then we had a sustainable textile professor from Mass Art. And so we had this whole conversation. What are the challenges of using natural dyes, matching dye lots? What are the advantages? Never did we say a negative thing. And the very first question out of the audience was, so let me just understand this. Are you trying to say conventional dyes are harmful? And we hadn't, but of course that was the implication. And I just I started to realize eco-sessions after eco-sessions that consumers hadn't caught up. So I'd been writing about these issues. I've been talking about the environmental and the social impacts of fashion for, at that point, 6 or 7 years, and the consumer was still lagging. So I thought, okay, we need to do more. So I wrote this book because I really thought that consumers need to know what's happening in this industry. It's not like it's a small industry. Whoops. It's the third largest, right? It's $2.4 trillion in trade, and I don't even think that that considers what you guys do and what you contribute to the industry. It's currently, as Lisa said earlier, we're producing 150 garments per year. The growth in this industry since 2000 is 60%. It's one of the fastest growing industries. You know it, you see it, you know consumers are buying things, they're producing things way faster than they ever had. I just got some numbers earlier. So Zara, so if you think about traditional fashion, it used to be 2 seasons, right? Spring, summer, fall, winter. So back before we kind of had this mass acceleration, designers were only doing 2 seasons. Then they started to add resort, holiday. Some designers are doing 6, some designers are doing 8. If you read any sort of business fashion headline, you hear that designers are burning out. Zara is producing 24 collections a year. 24 collections, right? So they're putting churn, they're putting stuff in stores every single week. And H&M, you think that H&M is larger, H&M is about half. So H&M is producing between 12 and 16 collections per year. And I call it fashion, but it doesn't matter what we call it. We could call it clothing, we could call it apparel. There's nobody in the room who's not wearing it. It involves all of us. And I think one of the things we need to look at is kind of how we got here. And anybody who's been in the market in North America and tried to buy a pre-war house, you know the closets are this big. And there's a reason for that. Because people prior to World War II, women only had about 9 outfits. And now they're buying about 60 pieces per year. And back in those days, those 9 outfits had a value of between $100 or $200. Now the average price at 60 garments per year is $19. So there's no kind of attachment, there's no kind of sense of commitment towards this new consumption level. And I think, I love this quote because when I was writing the book, I was really fascinated by consumption. And make no mistake about it, the number one thing I think we need to do to fix this industry is to slow down consumption. And I think that price has something to do with it, because when the prices are so cheap, there is no attachment. It's kind of mindless buying. Anybody who's seen YouTube videos, you know these haul videos. There's there's teenagers, preteen girls who are buying as much as they can for $50, $75, and then kind of sharing with the YouTube generation of what they got. And if you've watched any of these, they're called haul videos because of the big haul that they got for their $50 or $75. A lot of times it's not even an engagement with the clothes. I bought this because, well, it's blue. Next piece. I bought this because, well, it was only $9.99, so I bought 2 of them. And there's not any real kind of connection to the things that people are buying, the way that they're thinking about how they're dressing themselves, partly because of the price. And we can see this. So the other research says that on average now, consumers are wearing clothing only about 7 to 8 times. So they're buying these 60 pieces a year, they're stuffing them in closets, and they're never wearing them. So what's ending up happening, these are the 10 items most likely to remain unworn, which is great for you guys, but not necessarily for the industry at large. So shoes, obviously people buy them, they get them home, doesn't fit, doesn't match, didn't do what it wanted to do. Dresses, coats, tops, we're in a crisis. And McKinsey, you know that Fashion Weeks is starting to gain traction when all the big consulting companies are getting involved in research. And so McKinsey did a report in October, and they estimated that 3/5 of all garments that are produced will be either end up in landfill or be incinerated within the first year of production. So earlier, Matthias had kind of gone into the carbon footprint of what that takes to make a garment, what's happening, like how many greenhouse gases go into growing the cotton. So 1 kilogram of cotton takes, I think, 23 kilograms of greenhouse gases to produce. And if it's only lasting 1 year, or 60% of it is only lasting 1 year, then we're headed for a crisis. And so when I wanted to write this book, I wanted to kind of drill down to it. And I wanted to talk to consumers on a level that I thought that they would understand. And I really went back to food. And I thought, okay, there's really something that consumers got about organic food. There was really some connection that they made that kind of made the organic food movement grow to 10% penetration in a way that fashion did not. So could we talk about it in a way that might get them? And so Larea Pepper, she's an organic farm pioneer. She's also the head of the Textile Exchange, if anybody knows her. She's a big advocate of organic cotton. And so she has this quote, and I thought this is exactly what I want consumers to understand. They understand that the food that they put in their bodies affects their health, but they're not making that connection about the things that they put next to their largest organ, their skin. And so could we have a conversation with them where they started to understand the chemical inputs that are in clothing and on clothing and how that's maybe affecting their health. And then I couldn't really talk about clothing without also talking about personal care. So it became kind of a book about impacts and about the environmental impact of chemicals in the personal care products that we use. So shampoo, clothing, underwear. And it starts, one of the biggest stories or one of the biggest case studies that I talk about is this project that Greenpeace did. Did anybody remember the Detox Fashion campaign? So Greenpeace has been promoting water health, really promoting marine life for ages. And so somehow they kind of made this parallel connection that if we're going to support marine life and we're going to support marine health, we need to really look at the water. And fashion, as Matthias said earlier, is very harmful to water systems around the world. And so Greenpeace noticed, or had it brought to their attention in 2009, 2010, that in this delta between the Yangtze and the Pearl River, which is a high-intensity production area for apparel, that the rivers were running the colors of the season, so that you could see the dyes in the river, and they became curious. Well, if the dyes are in the river, what else is in there? So they started to take water samples, and this was the very first time that Greenpeace had kind of gone out of saving the whales and saving the seals and really kind of delved into advocacy in a different industry. And they really were very methodic about it. So first they did the water samples and they released, oh my goodness, we have found these chemicals. Some are persistent, some are endocrine disrupting, which means that they affect the hormones and reproductive systems of all of nature's creatures, including us. And so they released that they had these chemicals. So anybody with a sense of what was coming, who was producing in that area, should have gotten nervous. And Greenpeace reached out to all of the companies that were manufacturing in those zones, Zara, Nike, Adidas, H&M, and said, look, we found these chemicals, is it your factory? And there's restricted chemical lists. So every single brand said, no, we abide by the restricted chemical list, there's no chemicals in our factory. So next report, Greenpeace went out at retail across 21 countries and bought 41 garments. And then they tested the garments. And then they knew by the residue on the garments matched with the chemicals that they'd found in the water exactly who was not abiding by the restricted chemical list. And this did two massive things for the fashion industry. Number one, it showed brands that their supply chains were not transparent. And in fact, what brands thought were happening was not what was happening. And it also raised a huge flag for consumers. Because if that chemical residue is still on the product, you're bringing it home, you're bringing it to your own watershed, you're bringing it to your own local water systems. You're washing what has been recognized as a restricted chemical, but because it was over there in production, nobody really thought about it. Now we're bringing it into our own backyards and we're putting it through laundry into our own water systems. So it started to get people really conscious about what's happening, what is really happening in apparel, and how is it affecting the consumer, and why don't the brands know about it. The other thing that started to happen in the last couple of years is that there's been way more dialogue with brands and with consumers about what the environmental impact is. So there's water chemicals, there's deforestation. Because of this $19 price point for most of the pieces of garments or pieces of fashion that people are buying, a lot of that has to come at the really low cost of material. And viscose and rayon, as you know, is one of the lowest to produce. But you can't produce 150 billion garments of viscose and rayon without tapping into endangered forests, old growth forests, Indonesian rainforests. So now, after we've been worrying about palm oil and a whole bunch of other industries causing deforestation, fashion is also now involved. And then there's the social implication. So I think one of the things that I think is also difficult for consumers and for all of us to think about, so you think about all these chemical side effects, you think about the environmental impact of what you're wearing when all you really want to do is just get dressed, but then now there's the social impact. And so in 2011, the Rana Plaza factory collapse happened. This is a factory in Dhaka in Bangladesh that was supposed to be only I think it was only supposed to be 4 levels, and they had illegally built 3 more levels on top to maximize space. And of course, all of that weight of apparel production on 8 stories that was only scheduled or certified for 4 stories, they started to have cracks in the ceiling, they started to have cracks in the walls. On the day that it collapsed, which was April 23rd, the workers could see cracks in the doors. They're not so organized, they're not so protected. They were ordered to go to work or lose their jobs. At about 9:07 in the morning, the factory collapsed and 1,200 people lost their lives. And this should not happen. We had this happen at the turn of the century. We had these kind of industrial accidents at the turn of the century in the 1900s with the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York. I don't know if anybody remembers that history. Like we kind of outgrew that, or so we thought. Brands thought that, consumers thought that, and now we're having this conversation again. What's the implication of the workers in this industry? And there's a lot of pressure about forced traffic, human labor, and slave labor. And what it turns out, the ILO, the International Labor Organization, reckons that 4 of the 10 most likely to traffic children involve the fashion industry. You have cotton picking, you have apparel production, you have diamond mining, and you have gold production. So between fashion and jewelry, because jewelry sits kind of under fashion, we're also not taking care of the world's children. And in fact, the ILO estimates that 11% of the global children population are working in forced labor situations, meaning that they have to go to work instead of being able to go to school. So you pair all of this together, and it's a very dismal scene. And I'm glad that you've all had lunch and you're a little drowsy and maybe it's not all sinking in. But this is kind of what I wanted the book to do. I wanted it to really wake up consumers. I wanted to have a conversation about what's called a body burden. And the body burden started in early 2000s. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, started to measure how many chemicals are in us and how many stay with us. They partnered with the EWG, which is the Environmental Working Group. It's an environmental nonprofit out of California. They did an umbilical cord test, newborn babies' first day of birth. They had 287 chemicals in them on their first day, 168 known to be carcinogens. So the world around us is impacting us. The things that we wear, the things that we actually put our money down and buy and put on us are impacting us. It could be anything from hairspray and body lotion to costume jewelry to any of our cotton clothes. I think Matthias was talking earlier about the pesticides and all the pesticide use, and what I'm not sure if he covered, or I'll just cover again, is that organic cotton does not have any of that residue. And in fact, if you're going to be GOTS certified and certify organic cotton all the way through the supply chains, it can't even go in the same gin as conventional cotton because the chemical residue stays in the gin and gets on the organic cotton. So we're really trying to make a statement about where the product comes from and who made it. So I lay all of this out in my book, and I really wanted to come up with solutions. I'm actually really optimistic about this industry. I really think that consumers have the power to make change. They make these choices, they make these purchases. We're all consumers in this industry. The ways that we put our dollars down could make change, but how could I tell consumers to just buy better? How could I reckon the 150 billion garments and this consumption issue without sounding hypocritical or without sounding kind of ingenuine? So I came up with this acronym called VALUE, because I thought, okay, lots of times people ask me, well, how can we do ethical fashion or sustainable fashion when we're on a budget? And I only buy, H&M products because I'm on a budget. And so I really wanted to come up with an acronym that would help people think about how to buy differently, that would really take into consideration budget. And so this acronym of VALUE kind of kept circling around. And so really what it stands for is vintage, artisan, oh, you're gonna love it, it's coming, local, upcycled, and then ethical. And really the vintage part is stop buying new. And I tell this in my book, and I tell this every time I speak. Stop buying new. Do I need to buy it? Does it need to be new? The circular economy is all around us. So, it's not just secondhand, it's borrowing, it's thrifting, it's swishing, it's swapping. Like I tell this story, my mom has a cashmere winter coat in her closet. We're Canadians, we go through coats periodically, but there's always a good coat. So my mom has this good coat that she's had for 20 years, and it fits me like a glove. It's beautiful cashmere, and she just saves it for the rainy days or the freezing days. And every winter I say, Mom, just give me the coat. Like, let's put the coat into circulation. Let me wear the coat. And I feel that way about, you need something. If a standard consumer needs something, go out and borrow it. Call your mother, call your aunt, go to the local thrift shop. Buy something, especially if it's on trend. If 1970s flower dresses are on trend this season, go down to your local vintage shop and buy it from the 1970s and be really on trend. And then take all that money that you save by buying vintage and borrowing things, and then buy better. So the A stands for artisan. So we have all of these creative communities around the world that are really living close to the land. They have a really small footprint. They're not involved in kind of this mass consumption life that we've created in the West. And can we save that? Forget the fact that machination and mass production in China can knock off Kenyan beaters, but can we just buy from Kenyan beaters? Could you buy something that was indigenous to Guatemala weaving, or buy something that is really from an artisan community so that we can put money back into those artisan communities? And in fact, does it have to be so far away? Could you just buy something local, right? Could you buy from a local brand? So when we talk about artisan, the UN has been working with artisan communities, Stella McCartney, matching brands like Stella McCartney, Vivienne Westwood with these artisan communities to really kind of do this high-low matching so that we can get artisan materials and artisan craft work out of those communities and onto the fashion stage. The same thing is starting to happen with local. I also don't want to talk politics, but a lot of countries are trying to be great again. It's not just this one. Everybody is really trying to reshore their local production. And I think that as consumers, we should be supporting that. We should be looking to buy from local designers, small makers, right? Really trying to see what industries are struggling in our own backyard and what can our purchases do to support them. Study New York. She's a Canadian designer, but she's based in Brooklyn. She makes everything with ethical textiles right there in Brooklyn. She does really small batches. She's very picky about how many stockists or retailers she has. She only needs to make this much money. She could probably make this much money, but she's just very realistic, and I find that about a lot of this generation and a lot of this industry. They just want to make the right amount of money. They want to do the good thing in the world, they want to have a good legacy, and they want to make the right amount of money. Another example of my value acronym is upcycled. So can we support designers? Can we support brands that are taking things that are on their way downstream and using design methodology to bring it back? So here's a popular example, Freitag. Does everybody know this brand? So this is out of Germany, Switzerland, actually these two brothers. So this is Brazilian truck tarp. So it's PVC basically, but they wash it, they sew it. These are seat belts. And this bag is probably 5 years old. They repair it for free, and it's a lifetime purchase. So I've saved the truck tarp from the landfill and actually produced business for a brand that's really trying to do stuff with waste. Christopher Rayburn's another example. This is in London. He's part of London Fashion Week each season, and he only uses upcycled materials. So not truck tarps, but old army uniforms, old blankets. He made this great collection of dresses that used back in the day when wall maps were made of silk. So he's used all these atlases and wall maps made from silk to make these really beautiful dresses. And then we talk about ethical. And so I think that, if we had a couple bottles of wine on each table and we were going to have a conversation about what's more important, environmental rights, human rights, or animal rights, that we'd probably have a lively discussion. And I think that that's okay, because I think that we can have different points of view about what's more important, the people, the planet, or the animals. And there's designers for each one of those. And so they're not mutually exclusive. Sometimes the most environmentally forward materials come from brands that are still struggling with their reputation around the social aspect. For example, the Flyknit sneaker from Nike, right? It's a zero waste technology. That sneaker is really environmentally forward in terms of the R&D that they've put together. Would we say that brand is leading the way when it comes to social aspects in the workforce? That's probably debatable. But brands don't need to hit all the boxes. I think that you can say, you know what, this is what's really important to me, these are what my values are, and move towards brands that are doing that. So Liberté is another brand, a Canadian brand, that opened up it's the very first fair trade certified shoe factory in Ethiopia. So he's creating these shoes, he's creating fair trade work in Ethiopia, but it's made of leather. So if you're a vegan, you're really probably not going to support this brand. Eileen Fisher, Matthias mentioned earlier, she's made a pledge to be fully sustainable by 2020. It's a $400 million fashion brand, and she's doing everything she can to be fully sustainable, both environmentally and socially. Matan is another Canadian brand, fully vegan. Since the day they launched. They make bags and now they make shoes, recycled PET. Innovative textiles for the vegan market are not always the most environmentally forward. They're not fully biodegradable. They don't really have the best footprint. But people who want vegan products are really after a certain thing, right? They're really interested in pushing the conversation forward about cruelty-free living and about saving animals. So we don't need to hold them up to this level about, well, you should also be thinking about the environment. Let's let everybody have their values and move towards designers that resonate with them. And consumers are starting to ask questions, which I'm so excited about. That's what I want. I want people to actually look at a hang tag and be very curious. Who made it? What's it made of? Where did it come from? And campaigns are starting to get more traction. There's consumer campaigns almost everywhere you look. PETA's been doing it for 20 years, right? Really trying to get people to stop buying fur. The one in the top right is the Fashion Revolution. They're now in their third season. So they're on the anniversary of this Rana Plaza factory collapse, and they want consumers to ask any brand, ethical or non, who made my clothes? They really want to hold brands accountable for supply chain and make sure that brands don't forget that consumers want to know that nobody died making their clothes. So this campaign goes on for a whole week. Has anybody heard of this campaign? Anybody besides Steven, who made my clothes? Okay, next year, keep an eye out because it's on social media. They got over 9 billion hits. So So consumers are really getting active about this conversation. The one in the bottom left is Fashion Loved by Forests. So this is the anti-deforestation campaign. It's also an environmental group out of Canada. And they've been really pressuring brands like H&M and Zara to stop using old growth trees and to make pledges to only, if they're going to use viscose or rayon, to use it from forest stewardship certified forests. And then the bottom one is the Greenpeace campaign. So in the aftermath of that water test and finding the brands and identifying the brands that had the hazardous chemicals, all of those brands came together and they started something called the Zero Hazardous Chemical Discharge Working Group, and they all pledged to get all of those chemicals out of their supply chain by 2020. And they've been working really hard at it and being very transparent. So I mean, it could be chicken or egg. Is it the factory's fault, or is it the brand's fault, or is it both? But now the conversation is starting to be had so that everybody knows, let's get rid of these chemicals that are not needed. And I really believe this, that every time you spend money, it doesn't matter what kind of fashion you wear. It doesn't matter if you buy new or used. Every time you spend money, you're voting for the kind of world that you want to see. And so until we have carbon tax payments, or we have some sort of accountability for what the fashion industry is doing to the environment, we as consumers can really lead this pledge. And we can make better choices, and we can shift our dollars towards brands that we think really align with our values. And you're seeing it. I have not seen more bankruptcies happen in the last 6 to 8 months in fashion in North America. It's shocking. It's shocking, and I think that we're going to see more. So, the things that I think you should think about: do I need to buy it? Does it need to be new? Can my purchase support makers, either artisan or local? Does it mitigate waste? Can I buy something that's being upcycled? Can I buy something where they've taken some waste product and made it new again? And is it ethical? Does it match my values? And because I knew I was going to talk really fast, I have more. So the sustainable potential is that really you can wear clothes that are better for you, that are better for the planet, and that really kind of do the good that we want to see in the world. So let's talk about the afterlife. Because this is your business. This is why I'm so excited to be in the room with you, and I'm so glad to be invited, because I think you guys are at the forefront of really what's going to happen, and I think that there's a lot of disruption. So if you don't mind, I'll just tell you what I think is going to happen in your industry in the next little while. I think that there's some trends in reuse and recycling, and I think you have a battle against the landfill that you know, online resale and consignment, retailers as collectors, innovative materials, and zero waste. As I mentioned earlier, this quote that I did from the Cheap book, without this connection, consumers really don't value the things that they bought. They bring them into their house, they put them in the closet, they never think about them, and in their mind, they're already disposable. Another community in Canada was trying to figure out what the waste issue was, why so many clothes were ending up in landfills. So they did market research, and they had a bunch of young moms sitting in a room, and they actually were disclosing in the market research that they were embarrassed. That the clothes that they bought at Forever 21, H&M, those really cheap clothes, they were embarrassed to turn them in for recycling or donation because of the quality by the time they were ready to part with them. Because they weren't the same garment that they had bought, and they felt cheap to be giving such cheap residue of clothing. So I think that this is a really big issue that, you know, we talk about how little North Americans are donating, and this is part of the problem. The good news is that communities across North America are really championing this. San Francisco is trying to be the very first zero waste city, and they have a big campaign to really talk about textile waste. I was in Toronto last month, we were doing an eco sessions, and at two of the fashion colleges, they were doing like kind of public art displays to get students to recognize that socks and sheets and towels can also go into the donation bin, to really start to think about textiles as value, right? To think about all the resources that went in to make them and not to think of them as disposable, even if they are holey, even if they're misshapen, even if something is wrong with them. So I think that there's hope on the horizon, but I think that we should also take a look at what's happening globally, because it's not going to change overnight. So the US, according to my notes, so our collection rates in the US are 15%, Japan is only 12%, China is 10%, and China is the new market. Right? As Americans and our Western consumption habits start to decline and China's consumption goes up, if they're not recycling already, then you're going to have a big kind of hurdle to get them to think about this. The digital landscape is fascinating to me. I'm fascinated by how much money is being invested in these brands, how much money they're raising from venture capitalists. For example, Vestiaire Collective, which is out of Europe, raised $140 million last year. Material World, which asks consumers to ship directly to them so that they can put it on their site, raised $40 million last year. So there's a lot of money in this space for consumers to go directly to online consignment. And now that brands realize that the natural resources to build the 150 billion garments are not going to last forever, they want their material back. Eileen Fisher is a prime example. Last year she launched a campaign called Green Eileen. She takes her clothes back and she resells them at a discount in her store. So she uses all the money from the resale to go towards a foundation that promotes women's issues and women's entrepreneurship endeavors. So she's taking the clothes back, she's repairing in-house, and she's doing it. She's not the only brand. Philippa K's been doing it in Sweden, and a couple of other brands are really starting to do this. And I think that we're starting to see brands get very interested in this. What could we do to build a relationship with our consumer so that those clothes never go into a stream, that they stay with us and we can recycle them? And then there's all the new materials. So let me just get my number because I was very surprised. So Walmart, in 2016, Walmart awarded $3 million to US universities to come up with new and innovative materials. The CNA Foundation gave away $1 million this year to something called Fashion for Good, also for innovative materials. And H&M has just finished their second year of giving away €1 million for innovative materials. And so what they're trying to do is find ways to have natural fibers, natural materials, but from different sources. So the winners from last year was one out of Italy made from orange fiber. But there's no life cycle assessment. We don't know what this is going to do in the stream. We don't know if it's going to have longevity past a couple of wears. We don't know if you're going to be able to repurpose it. Pinatex is also now made out of pineapple. The winner this year at H&M is made out of the residue from the wine making endeavor. So they can make this mock leather with the wine skins. And then everybody's talking about mushrooms in New York. They love mushrooms. It's a replacement for styrofoam. They're starting to think that it could be a leather. It could be a whole bunch of things. But again, the afterlife or the extended life properties of these new innovative textiles, unknown. And then there's the future is zero waste. So I was talking about this last night. So Iris Textiles in Guatemala has launched a new line called the New Denim Project. Because of all of the jean and denim production in Guatemala, they've gone around and picked up all the pre-consumer scraps and made partnerships with West Elm to do a kitchen line, with Wool and the Gang to do knitting line, and to find ways to kind of repurpose the scraps. And I see this as being huge, huge, because circular economy is the buzzword in everybody who understands this and everybody who's moving in the direction of sustainable fashion. They're already on to circularity, and they're already on to kind of closing the loop and how can we close the loop. And brands see it as very profitable because it makes sense in their sustainability reports. So your next future markets. Brazil, China, India, Mexico, and Russia, apparel sales grew 8 times faster in the last year than they did in Canada, Germany, the UK, and the US. So your future markets, your future consumers are over there. And this means that there's chances to kind of, the ways that maybe this system is broken, the ways that North Americans really won't recycle textiles could maybe be mitigated already in those markets. You could start these conversations earlier. We could kind of avoid some of the things that we've had in these markets. So my final points. The fashion industry shows no signs of slowing down. I don't believe that ending consumption is really going to be the way that this industry changes. I think they're going to pivot inside the industry. I think they're going to finally use innovation. They're going to finally use circularity to kind of fix all of the ills. But ending consumption is on no one's radar, except mine. Consumers are being re-educated on how to make sustainable choices. So you have people like me writing books and doing podcasts, but then you also have all these campaigns, Greenpeace, PETA, all these kind of environmental groups really doing these campaigns to get consumers to wake up and think about the choices they're making in this industry. And to that end, the environmental impact of the industry is being tackled on many fronts. So there's, and Matthias really covered this kind of well earlier, right? Levi's is trying to do zero or water less, right? Other brands are really trying to work on sustainable cotton. Other brands are really trying to work on their supply chains. The circular economy and afterlife is the low-hanging fruit for disruptors. Anytime I hear anybody in sustainable fashion circles talking these days, they're talking about circularity. And the next wave of consumers is ready for you. So my podcast you can find on iTunes if you ever want to hear me have these conversations with people in the industry. Eco Sessions, we are now in 6 cities, so we hold events monthly in Toronto and Montreal, LA, New York, London, and Berlin. And we're going to open some new cities soon. So if you're ever in any of those cities, you want to join a panel, you want to have a conversation about recycle, let's do it. I'm doing a masterclass in ethical fashion at FIT this summer. So if you know anybody, designers particularly, who want to study ethical fashion, 4 days at FIT, it's so cheap because it's a state college. I think it's $270 US for 4 days of class. And we're doing a book signing. Does anybody have any questions? Hi, can you keep your hand up so that the microphone can come?
Hi, Kate. My name is Shayla from ThreadUp. Great presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
I just have one question. In addition to responsible consumption, many of us look for less harmful ways to care and clean for our garments. I've come across organic dry cleaning. I wanted to know your thoughts on that, or if you had any information on how to care and clean for our garments in a more responsible way.
Great. That's a great question. I love that. Yeah, I'm a big fan of no wash, actually. And I've really I've come to this over time because I think when you look at some of the great denim brands, right? Organic cotton, denim, selvage denim. Nudie Jeans is an example. They're a new denim company out of Sweden. They don't want you to wash the jeans because it starts to deteriorate the fiber. And once I started to think about that, I thought, actually, that's probably the case for a lot of issues. And we didn't talk about that, and the EPA didn't talk about it, but I sit on the EPA's Trash-Free Waters task force, and so all of this microplastic and microfibers in the water is a really big issue. Like, we're just waiting for the tsunami of consumers to understand how big that problem is, and industry has no idea how to fix it. So for that reason also, we should be washing less. So I'm a big fan of spot cleaning. I'm a big fan of, when I lived in Japan, they have these kind of pads that go under your arm for kimono because you can't wash kimono. And you can wash these pads. So you could not need to wash or clean your dress shirts because you could have sweat pads that you would just wash your sweat pad. So I'm all about alternative ways to clean and never dry clean. I really think nothing needs to be dry cleaned. Hang it out in the sun, right? It'll take care of the smell. It'll detox. The sun is a natural detoxifier for bacteria. It'll kind of sprucing it up. Or at the very least, just get a steamer and steam something. Hi.
Actually, mine's not actually a question per se, but more of a statement. We heard today about 700 gallons of water to make one T-shirt.
Yep.
So it kind of comes to mind that we're wearing more water than we're drinking, in a sense. It's not a question, but I just thought, it's something
It's
to
a
think
really
about.
good point, and I think that the issue about cotton is that it's very geographically specific. So I love those stats because they highlight the high, but the low, and Matthias mentioned this too, like there is rain-fed cotton. And so when brands like Adidas just pledged to use fully sustainable cotton by 2020, and so fully sustainable cotton means that you're using local strategies for pest management. So maybe you need to use pesticide, but maybe you don't. Maybe there's something else that you can do. And there's a really big movement in Africa called CMIA, which is Cotton Made in Africa. And it's really testing new seeds that can be rain-fed so that we could have great cotton. Burkina Faso, Mali, they're all testing it. We can have great cotton that is geographically specific to where it's being grown, and it can grow from very little water, rain sourced only, and a lot of sunshine. So cotton is, like, don't forget, cotton is a very political conversation as well. So a lot of that dialogue around cotton is really about how much money is invested in this country in cotton technologies, and so we kind of could separate that and look at it outside of this country and kind of see it in a different light, I think.
Hi, thank you for that talk. I was just wondering, these sustainable methods of production, they seem quite expensive, right? So how do you convince someone, particularly in sort of a lower economic, socially economic area, to buy, for example, from a thrift store, a shirt which costs $15 rather than going into H&M and buying something for $5? How can we as the consumer sort of make that convincing, that argument, for someone from a lower income?
It's definitely a challenge. First of all, I don't think that all let's back up. I think that fashion is very underpriced, so I think it's an unfair competition against the real price of fashion, right? So fast fashion has kind of augmented the price so that we don't really understand how much a t-shirt should cost. And I think that it's called fast fashion very aptly, because I think that in some of those markets and in economically declined markets, you understand that a fast food meal is not the most nutritious, right? It might be the most convenient, it might be the cheapest, but it's really, in your overall health, it's not the best choice. And I feel the same way about fashion. So I would never tell somebody not to eat a fast food meal, but I think that collectively we can start to have that dialogue about how nutritional choices are better for you in the long run, and I feel the same way about fashion. So I feel like you could buy a $3.99 t-shirt, but we all know that after 2 washes, it's going to have that mysterious hole, right, that just pops out of nowhere, and then that t-shirt is null and void. Whereas if you could spend a little bit more on something that's probably a little bit better made, right, you'd be able to have something that lasts longer. So there's a lot of conversations about cost per wear and really trying to get people, because in my mother's generation, it was a cost per wear, right? You bought a $200 or a $300 or $400 coat back in the 70s because you thought, this is going to be a coat that I have for 10 years. So you saved up so that was your purchase that year. And I feel like the whole economic system needs to be broken up a little bit. I think that we don't need to be buying 61 garments. We don't need to be spending an average of $19. We could take that money, even half of that money, and buy 4 really good things each year and actually have a healthier wardrobe. And that's why I really support vintage, because I think that there are some pieces that you really could buy secondhand if you look at the numbers about what people aren't wearing, there's a lot of product, and I'm sure you guys make great money off of a lot of product that has very little wear. But I agree. I think it's a very touchy conversation, and particularly in communities, because we have communities in Canada too that are really poor. So I want to be careful about what we're practicing or what we're preaching, but I don't think that it has to be expensive. I think it's just different choices. You have to wait for your microphone. One moment, please. Yeah.
No, I believe what you're saying is somewhat correct, but if you do not manufacture more clothing, then the birth rate has to stop, and that continues to grow every day. Look at your African countries, look at your Central American countries. They're not getting wealthier every day. They need that byproduct that is generated from this country or other countries today. And when you say vintage, vintage is only every 20 years. Because the 70s, the 50s, that clothing is long gone. So as long as there is a parent and there's a child 20 years younger than them, then that vintage will come back again. Okay? I think you add something to the environment. I think you did a great exhibition on this. But without clothing, I can tell you, the people in Mexico, other people in the world, the people in Africa can't spend $4 for a shirt, okay, and buy 20 pieces. They wear that shirt until it falls off. And if it wasn't for the people that are here, that do these rallies and I think they add a lot to the value of clothing for the whole world.
I totally agree. I absolutely agree. Thank you very much for your comment. But I also think that there's a reason why China has the largest growing middle class, right? There's 1 billion people in China. This is the next generation of consumers. So this is not going to go anywhere. It's going to stop and slow down in the West, but Africa is also 1 billion people. So we have 2 burgeoning consumer populations ready to go. Like, this industry is not going anywhere.
Around
Yeah. However, the planet and the resources that we have to continue at this rate is problematic. We don't have enough water to continue this industry the way that it's going. And there's not enough land. To your point earlier with Matthias, there's not enough land to grow cotton for a burgeoning population. Or we recycle it. So there's 3 recyclers. There's one in Seattle, there's one in India working on recycling cotton fiber. So innovation, I think, can help this. I think we're going to see a lot of change in the next little while.
We did recycling. You've been doing recycling for 100 years. I've been in this business 50 years. Italy was a very big recycler because there's always something that said 60% wool, 40% other fabric. Okay? Cashmere is recycled.
Yeah.
The most expensive product.
I would like a bottle of red wine.
No
I think
problem.
we should have this conversation.
He would have brought it from Italy, and some hard cheese, like a Parmesan cheese. No, what I'm saying is that what the hell was I saying? Age is tough in this business. When I was a child, most of you people were not around.
And to be honest, to answer your other point, and I hope I didn't offend anybody, by when I use vintage, I use it ubiquitously kind of to mean thrifted and secondhand, because I don't think consumers understand that vintage is 20 years or older. And I do talk about that in my book, but I think most people think of secondhand as vintage.
Well, clothing is not worn. Only one user of clothing, maybe 2, or a hand-me-down from a child to another child. But clothing is the least product that has wear in it, or it's touched by your body. And a famous story was some lady was going to a show, and their kids were in my store in the village. Okay, and the lady's shaking her head and saying, how can they wear these broken jeans? How can they wear this type of clothing? I said, well, it's every college kid who was what they were wearing in the 70s or the 80s. Everybody can wear it. And I said, where are you going? She says, oh, I'm going to a show and I'm going out to eat. And I come back again, and she says, and I ask her another question, and she says, but the clothing is dirty. I said, no, we clean everything that goes into our store. And they're getting ready to leave after a couple hours, and I said, oh, by the way, did you bring your own utensils? She looked at me like I was crazy. I said, see, clothing is only worn by 1, 2, 3 people. But that fork or that spoon that you put in your mouth is 1,000 people. I don't think she was that hungry after that.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And that actually goes back to your point too, I think. When we talk about the value of clothes, there's something really lacking in fast fashion and poor quality, which is the hand-me-down factor. Like we have a whole generation now who's not wearing hand-me-down clothes anymore. Like the quality just won't go from sibling to sibling. So this is something else we need to kind of figure out how to talk about when it comes to the price factor of clothing.
Okay,
This is serious.
Yeah, our table had one of the questions for the proposed EAC ban.
Yes.
And in doing some research on that, one of the things that I discovered was that China, which you said is an emerging market, is building or sponsoring the building of manufacturing plants in East Africa.
Yes.
Is China doing that to help the local people manufacture their own clothing, or are they doing it to utilize the population to manufacture clothing for export to China?
I would say the latter. But Stephen, would you like to add? There's a lot of conversation about that. There's a lot of, and this is kind of what came out of Greenpeace and really came out of the Rana Plaza factory, is now consumers are starting to look at supply chains and really ask questions. There's no doubt that there's outsourcing, and a lot of what you're talking about is outsourcing. So that China is taking the order because they have the reputation, they have the experience with the company, and then they are parsing it out to their factories. And I'm not from this country, so I don't really understand the duty-free zones and how you can create production in Dominican Republic and create something there, but then bring it into the U.S. I think it's more about that. I think it's really a crafty way to do trade that kind of circumvents duties and tariffs. And I think that it also really kind of tries to capitalize on the fact that the industry wants things to be cheaper still, and China now has a burgeoning middle class, and so they want to be paid well because they want to buy things, they want to buy clothes, they want to buy jewelry. They're buyers now. So in order to kind of match that together, there needs to be outsourcing to communities that would work for less.
So it's a little self-serving.
Absolutely.
We also has another meeting where you brought it up regarding, this tax on used clothing, in East African countries.
There's actually another part to that.
Okay, yeah.
Hey, wait a minute, I got the mic.
If China's looking to build that network, a payoff in the government or payoff in somewhere where they can control and get the clothing and keep some of the clothing in the country and move some of the clothing out to stop that used clothing from coming in.
You have to go back to the mic. It's actually it's a bigger, it's a huge.
It is a huge.
About the natural resources of the country. And
Please don't have to back.
I mean, it's a huge.
Hey,
It is.
Where we want to capture the natural resources of the country. So we'll build a factory here, you employ 100 people. And we'll buy all the minerals
Oh, so let me just to build on this point, and Kate Black, so it's a little bit of a digression, but I'd encourage everybody in this room. The question was about the EAC ban on used clothing. So that's the East African communities ban on used clothing, and that'll affect everybody in this room and our income, because ultimately one of the biggest markets for this product is East Africa. So call your congressman, call your senator, and say, hey, what are you doing about this East Africa? Because it is going to affect us all. But to the question of why in China, the United States is a free trade agreement with East African countries. They put them under a preferential trade, meaning that anything produced in Kenya and shipped to the United States has no duty.
Yeah.
So the irony is the Chinese are moving factories to East Africa, promising to move factories to East Africa, which ultimately that product could be produced and sold at the H&M in New York. And so, without duty. So this is a complete digression from poor Kate's conversation, but so to your question of the China/EAC ban, just I'd encourage everybody in this room, the modern day, we have to be activists. Pick up the phone, write a letter, and ask your congressman and senator, what are you doing about the EAC ban? Because it is, I totally agree with our friend from Nomex. The used clothing business is about Africa, it is about Mexico, it is about this used market, but it's also about us being participatory, and I think that's one of Kate's big conversations. We need to ask questions.
I'm getting on the phone.
Hey, wait a minute, it's Friday night. It's Friday night, he's on the way to go play golf.
There's one back there. So I was told that everybody needs a Magnifeco sticker, right, for your prize. And so apparently, if you buy a book, you're absolutely getting a sticker. But I'll be over there if you have other questions. Hi.
Hi there. I have a question about young people. I am a mother, and I'm a firm believer in teaching my children the way I want them to act and behave. But just because I can be thrifty and I'm okay with it does not mean my teenage boy is okay.
Yeah.
Nike, Under Armour, all of those are a very big deal. I do not consider them to be fast fashion at $75 a shirt. At all. He doesn't have many of them. But how do we get our young people more into, because I will go to the thrift store in my neighborhood and buy him dress shirts for school or anything like that. Is there something that we can find online perhaps, or some education? How do we get the young people involved into becoming more thrifty, because they are the next generation. They are the ones who are going to save this. I really believe that.
I have this question, not at the high school age or younger, but I get this question at colleges a lot when I speak to colleges, because college students also have very limited budgets. And I, as a kid, grew up with hand-me-downs. I never got a brand name thing until I got a job at 16 and bought my first branded garment, right? So and for a long time, I wouldn't wear secondhand. For a long time, because I had it as my childhood, and I just kind of thought I was better than that until I realized, oh, actually, it's better quality if I go secondhand. So I had to kind of make my own evolution, and I feel like that kids also need to do that. And again, it kind of comes back to fast food, right? Like, kids know that they don't feel great after they eat a McDonald's or a Wendy's, but it's kind of the rite of passage. They've got fast metabolism, they can do it, and it's okay. And so to want those things, when so many marketing messages are drilling them that this is what kids of status have, we've been going against that for decades. We've really been fighting against media messages about what status symbols are and which brands are status symbols. And so there's a couple of movements in New York. There's a program in the Bronx where they're really kind of having this conversation with kids, particularly kids of color, about the history of cotton in this country and why buying cotton at a cheap 5 and dime store is perpetuating that history for their population. Which I think, whoa, like that's really getting kids involved in what the deeper roots of fashion is. There's another group, and I've seen a few splinter groups called Hacking, and they're really kind of trying to they're almost like breaking the brand. So kind of so this is when thrifted would work. So kind of remaking the brand, so the Under Armour brand, into something that's their own brand, and kind of changing that. So it's a little bit of a hack to kind of re-own what that marketing message is. These are all things like you have to have kids who are like really interested in activism that to kind of, I think, get into this, and not a lot of kids are. They just want to be like the other kids at school. So I feel your pain, and I don't know that we have the answer to that yet.
Is Nike and Under Armour, are they part of any group where they?
Yeah, so Nike's been doing a lot of work with the social Sustainable Apparel Coalition. So the two bedfellows of Walmart and IKEA and Patagonia in like 2008, 2009 came together and said, you know what, we're not going to fix this ourselves. So they've been having roundtable meetings with all the top brands to try and open up supply chains, to try and make, and Nike had this tool that they've been building for a while that they brought to the Sustainable Apparel Coalition called the Hague Index on ways to kind of rate factories on like a gold, silver, bronze ideology. And rather than decamping and leaving, trying to help all those factories scale up to the next level so that they could charge more, and really trying to kind of work on the supply chain where it needs the work, as opposed to just cutting and running when they see problems. And then Nike did this other really fantastic thing. They had in their R&D department, they had a lot of designers come and ask, what has the less footprint? Recycled poly or recycled nylon? And so they built an app, and it's called the Making app. You can get it, download it on your phone. And so they started to put all their life cycle assessments of materials into this app, and then they took it to the London College of Arts and had the fashion students play with it so that it's totally built for designers to understand the life cycle assessment and impact of certain materials in terms of water and resource use, and then they open it up to the world. So like, I mean, those brands are really, they got the money. I think that they could be doing a lot more, but they're definitely leading the way in terms of R&D. And they have great resale value, right? So maybe when your kids get that money together and they buy that perfect thing, they could resell it, which is what a lot of kids are doing to kind of fund that status purchase the next time, because those brands have resale value.
Thank you.
I think this would be the last question.
Yeah, are we cutting into break time? I really appreciate all the questions, and like I said, you can come up and ask me anything.
Hi, yes, thanks for the great presentation. I was thinking, do you feel when working and doing your work, what kind of pushback do you get from, industries? I remember part of your first comments that you compare to organic food somewhat, and we can see, among others here in the US, many of the local smaller brands perhaps are being bought up by, mainstreams, maybe not culprits, producers, but obviously companies perhaps that want to do some window dressing to their image more than sincerity perhaps. Or if you could...
There's definitely in the beauty and personal care industries, that's happening a lot, right? Like Colgate bought Tom's of Maine toothpaste, which used to be like a non-toxic toothpaste. Like we can see that in the beauty and personal care industry a lot. They're buying up all the green brands. In fashion, not so much, but mostly because of the economy of scale. So a lot of the brands that are doing things differently, a lot of brands are doing zero waste patterning, so they're figuring out how to lay out their patterns so that there's not any offcut, not that regular 15 or 20% waste. And bigger brands just don't have the bandwidth yet to take on those smaller companies and kind of absorb them. I called it, in my book, when I was doing the research in 2014, I called it greening through the back door, because the more I wanted to, and I'm not really a big slammer of brands, like Nike, unfortunately, they cannot get away from that moniker, and I don't bring it up. The New York Times keeps bringing it up about their history with people in slave factory or slave labor. But so some brands kind of have that legacy that they can't really get away from. And when I was really looking for a demon for my book, I was surprised how many brands were really working on this stuff covertly and not telling customers about it at all. So that Flyknit sneaker is a perfect example. Nike has created a zero waste sneaker, and they don't tell anybody about about it because they want to be known as the performance brand and the cool brand, and they don't want to be known as the sustainable brand. So there's all of these things going on where brands are really, and I think it's a business imperative. The way that the fashion industry is moving, that 150 billion garments, we cannot keep going, and brands know that. So they're trying to figure out water, they're trying to figure out materials, they're trying to figure out circularity, like how can we recycle in our own supply chain so that we don't lose that money. Like now, everything that gets out of their supply chain, I think they're starting to think of it as a loss. So I think we're going to see a lot more brands step forward, like Eileen Fisher, and say this is what we're doing. And I think it will be very apparent who's not in that pool very soon, because I think there's only probably a handful of brands that aren't doing anything. Are we done? Thank you very much.